It's 9.2 AQA GCSE, the response to exercise. And here we have our learning outcomes. So state where in the body and how glucose is stored. Describe how your body responds to the increased demands for energy during exercise. And the last one, interpret graph or data to conclude a person's overall fitness levels. So here's a question. What do all these have in common? Well, of course, they're all muscles, but they are skeletal muscles, cardiac muscle, and involuntary muscle. In other words, we don't control it, it's just contracting on its own. And here is skeletal muscle looking at it close up. And what actually happens is, skeletal muscle is lots of cells joined together into these muscle fibres. And when each one contracts a teeny tiny amount, the whole muscle fibre contracts over a much greater distance. Now, we know that energy is released in the process of respiration. We use glucose and we add oxygen to it to release that energy. Glucose is our energy source for respiration. Sometimes when we're exercising, we can't get enough blood to the muscles, and so we're not getting enough glucose to the muscles. So what we do is we have a store of glucose in the muscles, and that store of glucose is called glycogen. And glycogen is made from lots of glucose molecules joined together. It's a highly branched molecule. Lots of glucose units joining together, because remember, glucose is a monosaccharide. So glycogen is actually a polysaccharide. It's got lots and lots of glucose units in there. Now, it's a large molecule, but it's a compact molecule. And that means we can store a lot of it in a small space. It also means that it's not going to leak out of cells because it's insoluble. If it was soluble, it might escape out of cells and we wouldn't be able to retain it in one place. When you get to A level, you'll also come across the idea that having a branched molecule, there's lots of ends for the enzymes to work on. So you can release glucose really quite quickly when you need to. Okay, so stop the video and write a side heading and write some of the notes underneath that we've just discussed. Hopefully you've said that glycogen is stored in muscles, it's a store of glucose, it's a polysaccharide, it's highly branched, that means it's insoluble, we're able to retain it in cells. So when do we use glycogen? Well, we use glycogen when we literally can't get enough blood to our respiring muscles. So perhaps during intense periods of exercise, we need a little bit of extra glucose that our blood just can't supply, so we'll break that glycogen down very quickly. Okay, so let's just have a little quick review at some of these questions. What are muscle tissues made of? Well, muscle tissues are made of muscle fibres, lots and lots of cells joined together, and when each one contracts a little bit over the length of the muscle fibre contracts and we get a shortening of the muscle. Next question, how do they allow movement? Well, if you think about it, your muscle here is attached and then with a tendon across the joint onto the other bone. So when this muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, which pulls on the bone, and that allows the movement of the arm. Stop the video and let's get this flowchart down to answer question 2. And of course, one of the features of tendons is they are non-elastic. If they were elastic when the muscle contracted, then you wouldn't get any pulling on the bone across the joint. Okay, next question, we alluded to this in the lesson yesterday. We said, why do muscle cells have a lot of mitochondria? They have a lot of mitochondria because mitochondria are the site of respiration. How is glucose stored in the muscles and the liver? Well, we've already said that glucose is stored as glycogen. So let's discuss how we would describe how the body responds to increased demands for energy during exercise. Well, to get energy, we need to respire more. And the two reactants that we need for respiration are glucose and oxygen. How do we get more oxygen? Well, we know that normally we breathe in oxygen, and so what we do is we increase the number of breaths we take per minute, we increase the breathing rate, but we also increase the depth of our breathing. In other words, we actually, with each breath, we take in a greater volume of air. So that's how we get more oxygen. How do we get more glucose? We get more glucose by the heart pumping more blood. There's two ways that the heart can pump more blood. It can increase the times it contracts, the number of beats per minute, and it can also increase the volume of blood that each contraction of the heart pumps. So with both the lungs and the heart, we can increase the number of times the heart contracts or the number of times you breathe per minute. And in both cases, we can increase the volume of air or the volume of blood that is pumped. How can we measure fitness? Well, let's have a look at these two individuals here. We've got Mr. Red and we've got Mr. Green. And they've just done an intense period of exercise for 3 minutes. And they've measured their heart rate before and they've measured their heart rate after. And they're arguing about who is the fittest. Well, who is the fittest? Stop the video and have a little think. Well, looking at the data, I would say that Mr. Green is the fittest. And that's because when at rest, he has a lower heart rate than Mr. Red. That generally means that the volume of blood in each contraction of the heart is more, the heart is stronger because each contraction is pumping out more blood. So he has a stronger heart than Mr. Red. Because Mr. Red also needs blood, but his heart isn't as strong, so he's having to pump more times to pump the same volume of blood around the body. Also, during exercise, Mr. Red's heart rate increased the most, and that means that his heart is having to contract more times, again, to pump a sufficient amount of blood around the body, whereas Mr. Green's can pump a bigger volume because his heart is stronger. Mr. Green also has a much quicker recovery rate, and that is a signal for being fitter than somebody else because it means there's less of an oxygen debt, and we talk more about that in 9.3. Mr. Green's got a lower heart rate during exercise and a quicker recovery time. So what's your response to exercise? Well, you could easily carry out the following investigation. You're going to measure your resting heart rate before exercise, and that would be in beats per minute. So whether you measured it for 15 seconds and then multiplied it by 4 to get it for the minute, or you measured it for 30 seconds and times it by 2. Either way, beats per minute. You can measure your resting breathing rate. It should be around 12 to 14. And again, breaths per minute. Then what you're going to do is you're going to do 1 minute of really intense exercise. Now that could be stepping up and down on a step, it could be jumping, it could be skipping, it could be any of those things. At the end, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to measure your heart rate after exercise, and you'll measure your breathing rate after exercise. Now, you've got that information. How do you then compare it to somebody else? Going back to this graph here, we've got Mr. Green and we've got Mr. Red, but they started on different heart rates. So it's not fair at the end to say that Mr. Red was so many more than Mr. Green. What we need to do, of course, is find the percentage increase in heart rate from before to after. We use the change over the original. We start with Mr. Red. Let's say his starting heart rate was on 80 and afterwards he was on 140. So the change is 60 beats per minute. His heart rate went up by 60. The original was 80. So what we're looking for is the change over the original times by 100. So here's our formula here, the change divided by the original times 100. 60 over 80 times 100. Mr. Green had a 75% increase in his heart rate. So in a moment I'm going to ask you to work out the percentage change for Mr. Green. Mr. Green started on 71 and after exercise his heart rate went up to 120. So use those figures, stop the video and work out the percentage change in his heart rate. And the answer is 69%. On the graph, although it looks like there's a massive difference between their fitness levels, if we just took into account the percentage increase during exercise, then what we would find is there actually isn't too much in it. And so that's why anytime we have different starting figures and we're comparing something, we need to work on percentage increase. So let's just summarise what we've said so far in terms of how the body responds to exercise. We've said that your heart rate increases and the volume of blood increases. We've said that your breathing rate increases and your depth of breathing increases. And we've also said that glycogen in your muscle starts to be converted to glucose, so it's available for respiration. All these responses working together help to get the reactants at the right place, at the mitochondria in muscle cells for respiration. And of course, we want to remove the carbon dioxide away as well. We want to take carbon dioxide from respiring muscles to the lungs where we breathe it out.
Question on response to exercise, so you've got an idea what you might be asked in an exam.
And you've got two variables from experimental data. Get used to them because they got a special mention in the examiner's report last year where they said that students really handled them poorly when they got questions on this. That shows the effect of increasing carbon dioxide content of the inhaled air on the number of breaths per minute and the total volume of air breathed per minute. And here's our graph. Number of breaths per minute on this side and the total volume of air breathed per minute in litres on the other side. And along the bottom we've got the percentage of carbon dioxide in air breathed in. Wow, what a graph. And at the bottom, the total volume of air breathed in per minute in litres.
Which is this one here with the little round dots.
And the number of breaths per minute
is with the square dots.
The question has asked us to describe the effect of increasing the percentage of carbon dioxide in the inhaled air on the total volume of air breathed.
We're talking about this one here with the dots.
And I can see we've got two stages to this graph.
Here is one and here is the other.
And this is what has an impact on this. So that's what we need to describe.
And we're just describing it, we're not explaining it. So I've got two regions, I've got this one, there's one, and I've got this region here, which is my second region. So I've got two things to say.
So how am I going to explain this? I'm going to say that as the percentage carbon dioxide increased, there was very little change in the total volume of air breathed in. Up till 5.6, after 5.6, any increase in the percentage carbon dioxide caused a rapid increase in the total volume of air breathed per minute. And the next part of the question says, suggest why the total volume of inhaled air is not directly proportional to the number of breaths per minute. So again, which lines are we looking at? So for example, it's saying, if we've got an increase here in the number of breaths, how come we haven't got an increase in the total volume of air breathed? Volume of air breathed in depends on the depth of breathing as well as the breathing rate. It depends on two things. So just because you increase one, it doesn't mean that we're going to get an overall increase in the volume of air breathed. In other words, the volume of the air breathed in is equal to the depth of breathing times the rate of breathing.